You've got to be kidding me. Karen? Whitley's voice cracked through the air like a whip as she stood at the end of my driveway, hands on her hips, eyes locked on my Tesla. This is not the kind of car that belongs in Crestwood Heights. I barely held in the laugh that bubbled up inside me. Was this woman seriously about to lecture me on my car? In my driveway? I stepped out of the house, the heat of the moment already buzzing in my ears. Are you really going to tell me how to park? I said, my voice low but sharp. Or is this just about me? Crestwood Heights was everything you'd imagine a gated community to be. Picture-perfect lawns, sidewalks cleaner than a hospital ward, and houses that looked like they'd been plucked out of an architectural magazine. Everyone in the neighborhood looked the same, white, upper middle class, pristine, and if you didn't fit that mold, well, you were an outsider. I had just moved in a week ago, fresh off a job transfer. Everything about the place seemed too good to be true, except for one thing. The HOA. I had parked my Tesla in my driveway right where I always did. The car was sleek, black, with just the right amount of shine to make it stand out, but it wasn't too flashy. I thought it was classy. Apparently, Karen Whitley, the HOA president, disagreed. I had barely started to unload the boxes from my car when she appeared like a storm cloud over my front porch. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. The moment she saw my Tesla, I knew she'd been waiting for an excuse to come down on me. "Oh, no," Karen muttered, shaking her head like I just insulted her very existence. "You really thought you could just roll up in here with that thing and not cause a problem?" I squinted, taken aback by her sheer audacity. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your car," she snapped. "It's an eyesore. It doesn't belong here. You'll have to move it. Now." "Are you serious?" I said, crossing my arms. My patience was already running thin, and we weren't even 5 minutes into this conversation. "Dead serious," Karen shot back, her lips curling into a smile that was anything but friendly. She stood there, her posture rigid like she was daring me to defy her. "This is a residential community, not some place for showing off. We have standards here." I looked at my car and then back at her, trying to process what was happening. "Are you telling me I can't park my car in my own driveway?" "Exactly." Her tone was laced with that same smug authority that I'd seen in every HOA president in the history of suburban communities. "We've had issues in the past with residents bringing in flashy, unnecessary vehicles. It disrupts the aesthetic of the neighborhood." "Are you really giving me this speech?" I said, my voice rising. "About a car? You've got to be joking. My car doesn't disrupt anything except your fragile little bubble. What is it? Too much for you to handle?" She raised an eyebrow, looking me up and down. "You must think your money gives you the right to do whatever you want, huh? Not here. Not in Crestwood Heights." "Yeah, well," I shot back, stepping forward, the distance between us closing. "I don't think your fragile ego gives you the right to tell me where to park either." Her face turned a shade darker, the veins on her neck pulsing. "This is my neighborhood, and you don't get to play by your rules here. I'm giving you a warning." "Warning?" I scoffed. "You're going to threaten me with a warning about my Tesla?" Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, her nostrils flared, and for a moment I thought she might explode on me. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but I could hear every word, sharp and venomous. "Move your car, or I'll make sure you regret it." Something in the air between us shifted. This wasn't just about a car. It was about control. I knew it. She knew it. And at that moment, I decided I wasn't going to let her bully me into submission. My blood was boiling, but I held my ground. "You know what?" I said, stepping back toward the front door. "I think I'll park it somewhere else." Karen smirked like she'd won, but I wasn't finished. Actually, I added over my shoulder, I've got another spot in mind. She tilted her head. What does that mean? I didn't answer. Instead, I marched to the back of the house. The helicopter pad in the backyard was hidden from view by a thick line of trees. I didn't expect her to see it today, but she was going to learn real fast that messing with me had consequences. Karen didn't realize it yet, but my patience wasn't infinite. There was no way in hell I was going to let her dictate how I lived or how I parked my car. But if it took a helicopter to get the point across, then a helicopter was exactly what she was going to see. And when she did, I had a feeling she wasn't going to know what hit her. The next few days were nothing short of a war zone in the suburban battlefield of Crestwood Heights. It wasn't just about the Tesla anymore. No, that had become a symbol. A flag planted in the middle of a quiet war where Karen was the self-declared queen and I was the rebel. By the third day after our confrontation, Karen had already filed a complaint with the HOA about the excessive visibility of my car. I wasn't surprised. This was just the first shot in what I was sure would be a long campaign. What did catch me off guard, however, was how quickly she mobilized the troops. Suddenly, I was getting notices for everything: an unsanctioned decoration on the porch, a welcome mat that was too bold, a stray leaf on my lawn, a garage door that didn't match the rest of the street. The list was endless, and the HOA's enforcers were circling like vultures, waiting for a reason to pounce. But they were mistaken if they thought I would back down. I didn't care about their petty standards. The Tesla was mine, and I had the money to park whatever I wanted in my driveway. They weren't going to control me. Still, there was something off about this whole ordeal. Karen wasn't just being difficult. She was deliberate about it, almost like she was enjoying every letter she sent, every complaint she filed. It was personal. I wasn't the only one who was noticing the tension. The neighbors started to murmur when they saw me walking to the mailbox. A woman from down the street, Sarah, even stopped me one afternoon to say, "You're not the first person she's done this to, you know. She made Mr. Thompson move his RV after it sat in his driveway for just 1 week. You're going to be in for a long ride if you don't back down." "Thanks for the warning," I said, forcing a smile, but inside I was already planning my next move. It was clear this wasn't just about a car. This was Karen Whitley trying to control something she had no business controlling. I could feel the pressure building like the slow tightening of a vice around my chest. Every time I walked out the door, there was another passive-aggressive note taped to my front door. Another complaint lodged against my property. It wasn't long before my mailbox became a mini HOA tribunal with a dozen official letters piling up every day. Most of them came with that same tired line: violation of community standards. I started collecting them, stacking the letters in a neat pile on the kitchen counter, each one a symbol of the fight that was coming. The tipping point came a few days after I'd parked my Tesla in the driveway again. I knew it would trigger something, but I didn't care. The moment I stepped out of the front door, Karen was there. Her car was parked directly across from mine, as if she was waiting for me. She didn't even bother with pleasantries this time. She marched up to me, fuming. "Move it now," she barked, not even bothering to hide the contempt in her voice. I tilted my head and squinted at her. "Excuse me?" I said, "Move it." She pointed at my Tesla like it was some kind of monster in the middle of the street. "I've had enough of this. You're not going to make a mockery of this neighborhood." I could feel the blood rising in my veins. "I'm not making a mockery of anything. You are. You're bullying me because you think you can." "Is that how you see it?" Karen sneered, her eyes flashing with that dangerous spark. "I'm protecting this community. You are the one making it difficult for everyone. Cut the crap, Karen. You don't give a damn about this neighborhood. This is all about you trying to prove something. Her face twisted with fury, but she didn't back down. This is my neighborhood, and I make the rules around here. You'll either follow them or leave. I'm not going anywhere, I shot back, voice rising. But if you think you can run me off, you're sorely mistaken. You're the one who's about to learn what it feels like when someone doesn't back down. I could see the anger boiling up inside her. But instead of yelling back, Karen just gave me that same smug smile. You'll regret this, she said, stepping back slowly. Trust me. That night, I sat in the living room staring at the stack of complaint letters. The more I looked at them, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just targeting me. She was targeting anyone she thought didn't fit into her little suburban utopia. I had been too focused on her specific attacks to see the bigger picture. I spent the next few days quietly observing not just Karen, but the whole neighborhood. What I found was a pattern that was hard to ignore. The complaints, the fines, the inspections, all of it seemed to follow a very specific timeline. Newer residents like me were the primary targets. If you hadn't lived in the neighborhood for at least a decade, Karen didn't hesitate to find any reason to go after you. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. One afternoon, I caught Karen standing at the end of my driveway, clipboard in hand, staring at my Tesla. This time, though, she wasn't alone. A couple of the other neighbors, who I hadn't spoken to directly, stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. I could tell they were curious, but hesitant to get involved. I approached her this time with a plan. What's the problem now? She didn't even look at me. Your car's still here, she said flatly. You've been keeping tabs on my car? I asked, trying not to sound too smug. That's kind of creepy, don't you think? Not at all, Karen shot back without missing a beat. I'm just making sure the neighborhood stays in line. You making sure you stay in control, Karen. Don't try to hide behind your rules. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw the hesitation in her eyes. She was starting to realize I wasn't going to back down. That was when I decided I needed to take action. Real action. I started documenting everything, every interaction, every complaint, every conversation I had with the neighbors. If I was going to win this battle, I needed proof, and I needed it fast. The more I observed, the more I realized Karen wasn't just abusing her power. She was abusing the whole system to push her agenda. By the end of the week, I had enough material to make a case. I started working with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, and every day felt like I was getting closer to bringing down Karen's little empire. Then the bomb dropped. A formal complaint came through the HOA's official channels. Excessive noise complaint from an unapproved vehicle. It wasn't about the car's sound. It was about Karen's need to control. The complaint was completely fabricated. My Tesla was practically silent when it started. But Karen was playing dirty now. She knew she couldn't get me with the simple stuff anymore, so she was stepping it up. I didn't panic, though. I just gathered more evidence, making sure every piece was airtight. If I had to go public with this, I was going to make sure it wasn't just me she was facing. It was everyone she'd bullied. The HOA board called me in for a meeting, the tension in the air so thick you could cut it with a knife. It wasn't a question of if I'd be fined or penalized. It was a question of how much I'd be forced to bend. They didn't even try to hide their bias. Karen was there, her arms crossed, smug as ever. The board was clearly on her side, but I wasn't going down without a fight. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with whispers. My fight with Karen had become the talk of the neighborhood, though nobody had the guts to openly take a stand against her. Except for a few. Sarah from down the street, The same woman who had warned me earlier came by to drop off some papers. A list of past complaints Karen had filed against other residents. "She's got a history of this," Sarah said, a note of sympathy in her voice. "You're not the first one to deal with her, and you won't be the last. But you've got a shot if you keep pushing back." I took the papers, my mind already spinning. The tide was starting to turn. Some of the neighbors were beginning to take notice. Others were keeping their heads down, afraid of getting dragged into the mess. But a few, like Sarah, were starting to realize that standing by and watching Karen run roughshod over me meant everyone was at risk. The division was clear now. Karen had made it personal, but I wasn't the only one she'd attacked. She had a list, and I was determined to be the one to take her down for good. The fight was no longer just about the Tesla. It was about control, about Karen's grip on the neighborhood, and it was tightening with every passing day. The formal complaint was just the beginning. A few days after the HOA meeting, I received another letter. This one wasn't about a noise violation or the car. It was about the tree in my front yard. The tree. The HOA claimed it was too large and too obstructive. A tree. I could make this stuff up. The letter was filled with that same bureaucratic language. Violation of community guidelines. Failure to adhere to aesthetic standards. Immediate removal requested. I ripped it open, the paper crinkling in my fist as I read it. I had seen this before. It was Karen's signature move. Find something, anything, to push me out. But this time I wasn't about to roll over. I knew what she was trying to do. The tree was the next soft target. It wasn't even a big tree, just an oak that had been there longer than Karen's petty rule book. It stood as a reminder that nature doesn't play by her rules. But I wasn't going to let her dictate the fate of the one living thing in the yard that wasn't artificially pruned to perfection. I called my lawyer immediately. "Another one?" he said when I sent him the letter. "They're just digging deeper now. If they can't get you with the car, they'll go for your landscaping." "Doesn't matter. They'll have to deal with me," I snapped back. "This tree stays." And that's when I decided it was time to really ramp things up. If Karen wanted a war, I was going to give her a fight she'd never forget. I gathered all the documentation, every photo of the tree, every letter I had ever received from her, and everything I'd learned about how the HOA operated. It was time to turn the tables. Word of my latest conflict with Karen spread like wildfire. There was no stopping it now. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. People had been whispering about me behind closed doors, some shaking their heads at how difficult I was, others curious about the fallout. But what had started as a small undercurrent of murmurs now exploded into an open rift in the community. Some neighbors started rallying behind me, though they weren't exactly marching into battle. They had their own lives to lead, their own private battles to fight, but there were a few who had seen enough. It wasn't just the car anymore. It was the way Karen had thrown her weight around, the way she'd made it a point to personally target new residents, to exert power over anyone who didn't conform to her image of suburban perfection. Sarah from down the street wasn't the only one now. A guy named Jack, a middle-aged, soft-spoken man who lived here for years, approached me one afternoon as I was tending to my yard. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the edges worn and creased. "You've got a bit of support, you know," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the street to make sure no one was watching. "I've had my issues with Karen before. It's not just you. She's been running this neighborhood like a dictator." "Tell me about it," I muttered, working the hedge trimmer in my hand. "You're not the only one she's tried to run out of here," Jack continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A few years back, she got a family kicked out for painting their house a color she didn't like. They weren't even that bright of a color, but it wasn't her idea, so she forced them to repaint it or leave. "So this isn't just about me?" I asked, looking up. "No," he said, shaking his head. "This goes way beyond that. I don't have the guts to speak up, but I'm with you. You need people to stand up to her. She's the real problem around here, not your damn car." I could see it in his eyes, the fear, the hesitation. But something had shifted. People were starting to talk. The silence that had once cloaked the neighborhood now felt heavier than ever, and Karen wasn't going to get away with it anymore. The tipping point came when Karen decided to escalate things even further. It wasn't enough to target my car, my tree, and my lack of conformity. Now she had gone straight to the HOA board, filing a complaint that my entire lifestyle was detrimental to the community. I had received my first official notice of a fine, $500 for failure to maintain appropriate decorum, whatever that meant. She was trying to break me. She had to know by now that I wasn't going to move my Tesla, and I sure as hell wasn't going to cut down my tree. But now she was getting desperate. The HOA board had scheduled another meeting to review my violations, and this time I knew she was going to pull every dirty trick she had in the book. I stood in front of my house, staring down at the neatly manicured lawn. Everything perfect, in the eyes of the HOA. And I thought about what it would take to truly end this. If Karen thought she had all the power, she was sorely mistaken. I wasn't going to sit here and let her destroy my life over a couple of trivialities. The night before the hearing, I made a decision. I wasn't going to play by her rules anymore. If she wanted to play dirty, then I would show her how to play the game. The meeting was packed. You could feel the collective anticipation in the air as I walked into the HOA hall. Karen was already seated at the front, looking smug, clipboard in hand, as if she had already won. But she hadn't seen what I had prepared. I didn't sit at the back like a passive bystander, no. I walked right up to the front and took a seat, papers in hand, my legal team seated behind me like backup. The room went silent. Karen's eyes narrowed when she saw me, and she knew. She knew. This wasn't going to go her way. The moment the meeting started, the board went straight into the proceedings. "Mr. Harrison," the board president said, "we are here to review the various complaints brought against your property." Karen stood up immediately, ready to launch her attack. "I've been forced to go to extreme lengths to maintain the standards of our neighborhood," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Harrison's behavior has been disruptive. He refuses to follow the guidelines we've established for our community." I didn't let her finish. "Karen," I said, standing up and cutting her off mid-sentence, "if you want to talk about disruptions, let's talk about you." The room went dead silent. Even Karen froze, her mouth hanging open for just a split second. "Excuse me?" she sputtered. "You heard me," I said, my voice steady but filled with an unmistakable edge. "You've been using your position to harass me, to bully me into submission. But what you haven't realized is that you're about to get exposed." The tension in the room was suffocating. The HOA hall, with its stark white walls and sterile fluorescent lights, suddenly felt like a battlefield. I could feel Karen's gaze on me, burning with that simmering rage she had been hiding behind her fake smile for weeks. She was waiting for me to back down, waiting for me to cower like everyone else had. But I wasn't going to do that. Not now. Not ever. "Karen," I said again, cutting through the silence like a hot knife through butter, "if you want to talk about disruptions, let's talk about you." The room shifted uneasily. The members of the board looked at one another, unsure of how to react. while the other homeowners shifted in their seats, trying to pretend they weren't eavesdropping on the drama. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "I beg your pardon?" Her voice was sweet, dripping with false innocence, but I could see the claws starting to show. "What do you think you're doing? You're disrupting this entire community." "No," I shot back, taking a step forward, feeling the pulse of adrenaline coursing through me. "You've been disrupting the community. You've been using your position to target new residents. You've been harassing me, and I'm done with it." I could hear the low murmurs of agreement from some of the neighbors. The tide was turning. People were starting to shift in their seats, glancing over at each other, whispering. But Karen didn't flinch. She wasn't backing down. In fact, she looked like she was about to rip my head off. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that she hadn't been expecting this. She had been so sure of herself, so sure that her position as HOA president gave her the upper hand. And now, for the first time, she was starting to see that she wasn't invincible. "Enough," she snapped, her voice rising. "You've had your fun. Now, I'm going to make sure you pay for this. You will leave Crestwood Heights. I'll make sure of it." I didn't flinch. "You think you can scare me? You think you can control me with threats and fines? Well, I'm done being your punching bag. If you think you can push me around, Karen, you've got another thing coming." The board president looked uncomfortable. Okay, let's all calm down," he said, holding up his hands as if he could diffuse the tension. But I could feel the room shifting. The eyes that had once been watching me with indifference were now studying Karen, and they weren't liking what they saw. "I'm not here to play nice, Karen," I continued, leaning in just enough so she could hear every word. "I'm here to expose you for what you really are. A power-hungry bully who uses her position to ruin lives. I've got the proof." Karen froze. She knew what was coming. I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, and that was the moment I knew I had her. The room went completely silent as I pulled out a thick folder from my bag. It was stuffed with papers, evidence, emails, photos, records of complaints, and, most importantly, documents that showed a pattern of abuse. I looked around the room, making sure every single person in that hall was paying attention. "I've been documenting everything," I said, my voice sharp, each word calculated to hit its mark. "Every letter, every fine, every false accusation. You've been using your power to bully me, and not just me. There's a long history of you doing the same to other residents here." I flipped open the folder and handed it to the board members one by one, watching their faces as they scanned the pages. The shock in their eyes was priceless. They hadn't expected this. Nobody had. "Let me show you what I've got," I continued, feeling the weight of every word. "This isn't just about my Tesla or my tree. It's about your abuse of power. You've been selectively enforcing rules, making up violations where none exist. You've been targeting people who don't fit your narrow, so-called standards. People who are different from you." Karen stood there, rigid, her lips trembling with fury as the board members flipped through the pages. The room was no longer on her side. I could feel it. People were reading about the long list of unjust complaints she'd filed, the way she'd personally targeted people who didn't conform to her ideal neighborhood image. "You think you've been sneaky," I said, turning to Karen, my voice low and cold. "But I've been keeping track. I've been documenting every violation, every unfair citation. And now it's all coming out." Karen's face turned white as a sheet, the color draining from her skin. Her eyes flickered between me and the documents, and then she looked at the board. She was starting to lose her grip on the situation, and she knew it. The power she'd held for so long, her iron grip on the community, was slipping away, and she had nothing left to hold on to. "You can't do this," Karen whispered, but there was no confidence left in her voice. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers. "Watch me." And then I turned to the board. I'm not just going to expose her abuse of power. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what she's been doing to this neighborhood. The fallout was immediate. Karen's face turned a shade of crimson I didn't think was possible. The board members were shifting uncomfortably, glancing at one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The weight of the evidence was too much for them to ignore. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now there was no coming back from it. The board president cleared his throat. "Well, this is certainly a lot to process." I could see Karen starting to unravel. She wasn't the confident, smug HOA president anymore. She was a woman caught in a web of her own making. The facade was crumbling, and the cracks were too wide to hide. "You can't just make this go away, Karen," I said, watching her tremble. "You've been manipulating the rules for your own benefit, and now the entire neighborhood is going to know." Karen started, her voice cracking. She tried to stand tall, but the power she'd once held over the HOA was gone. She could see it in their eyes. They weren't buying her lies anymore. "Enough," she snapped, slamming her fist onto the table. "I don't need any of this. I'll destroy you." The room gasped. Karen's threats no longer carried weight. She had lost. Her control was slipping away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. I could feel the shift in the room as the board members began whispering to each other. The whispers grew louder. A few of the neighbors, once hesitant to speak out, stood up. "We've had enough of Karen's rule." Sarah, the neighbor who'd supported me from the start, said, her voice firm. "It's time for a change." And with that, the tide completely turned. The room erupted into murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others still in shock at what had just been revealed. It was clear. Karen's reign was over. "I think," the board president said, his voice shaky, "we need to take a vote." Karen's eyes darted from one board member to the next, but they were all avoiding her gaze now. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. The vote was quick. The board, once loyal to Karen, now realized that their own positions could be jeopardized if they continued to back her. A majority voted to remove her from the HOA presidency. The moment the decision was made, Karen's face twisted into an expression of pure rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," she hissed, her eyes flashing with venom. "You'll regret this." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. "Not if I can help it," I said, turning my back on her. The room erupted into applause as the weight of the decision hit home. The HOA was no longer Karen's playground. It was ours. The community was finally free. The minutes after Karen's ousting were a blur of disbelieving faces and murmurs of shock. I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders as the board president, still shaking from the shock, read the final verdict aloud. "The HOA hereby removes Karen Whitley from her position as president effective immediately." The crowd was stunned into silence for a moment. Then, like a wave breaking against a dam, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't a victory just for me. It was a victory for everyone Karen had wronged, for everyone who had suffered in silence under her reign of terror. Karen stood there frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief, as the realization hit her. The control she had so carefully nurtured, the power she had wielded over this entire neighborhood, was gone. For the first time, she wasn't in charge, and it was a sight I would never forget. She opened her mouth, likely to unleash a final barrage of insults or threats, but no words came. Instead, she turned and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking against the tile floor like the last echoes of a dying empire. "I think we've all had enough of Karen's way of doing things," the board president muttered as he wiped sweat from his brow. "Let's move forward with the meeting." And with that, it was over. The room that had once seemed so stifling, so controlled by Karen's iron grip, now felt like a place of possibility. For the first time in what felt like forever, people were speaking freely. Neighbors who had never said more than a few words to me were now approaching, slapping me on the back, shaking my hand. "You did it," Sarah said, her eyes filled with pride. "You actually did it." "I didn't do it alone," I replied, glancing around at the people who had begun to stand with me. "This was all of us." People began to speak out, their voices rising with the confidence they had never had before. There was talk of revising the HOA's rules, of making sure that no one could ever abuse the system the way Karen had. There was talk of fairness, of community, of true unity. For the first time, the HOA wasn't a shadow looming over everyone. It was a space for collaboration, for real discussion about what kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in, and I had helped make that possible. The next few weeks felt like a different world. The whole neighborhood was changing. People started to work together instead of against each other. Those first few days after the board meeting were filled with apologies from neighbors who had silently supported Karen or had been too afraid to speak out. They came to me in person, one by one, some of them almost embarrassed to admit they'd been wrong about me. "Sorry, man," Jack said one evening as he passed me on the sidewalk. "I didn't know it was as bad as it was. I thought you were just some rich guy throwing his weight around." I chuckled. "Yeah, well, you don't have to be a billionaire to see a bully when you meet one." And it wasn't just the adults. The kids in the neighborhood started playing together again. They'd always been wary, knowing the subtle tensions between their parents, but now they were free to run across lawns and share bikes without fear of judgment. As for Karen, she was gone. She wasn't just ousted from the HOA presidency, she was banned from holding any future position in the community. The power she had so meticulously crafted was now a distant memory, and the fear she had instilled in everyone began to fade. I had thought I'd feel some sort of bitter satisfaction from her downfall, but I didn't. It wasn't about getting revenge on Karen. It was about breaking the hold she'd had over us all. It was about the people, the community, coming together to reclaim what was theirs. I took a deep breath, standing on the porch of my house one evening, staring out at the now bustling neighborhood. My Tesla, parked proudly in my driveway, no longer felt like an act of defiance. It was just a car in a neighborhood that was finally living up to its potential. "You're making a difference," Sarah said from behind me, snapping me out of my thoughts. She was standing on her porch, a cup of coffee in hand. "Yeah," I replied, smiling. "But it's not just me. It's all of us." She nodded. "We've all got a long way to go, but we'll get there." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. I didn't just feel like I had won a battle. I felt like we had all won something bigger. The chance to live the way we wanted to, without fear, without prejudice, and without the constant pressure to conform to someone else's idea of what's acceptable. Weeks turned into months, and the changes in the neighborhood were undeniable. People were finally talking, real conversations, not just polite greetings. Neighbors who once avoided one another were now working together to organize events, yard sales, block parties, charity drives. It was like a new energy had been injected into the community. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but there was something freeing about not having to worry about constant surveillance or the next petty violation. And the HOA? They were now a far cry from the authoritarian regime it had been under Karen. New rules were put in place, rules that focused on cooperation, transparency, and fairness. No one person could wield the kind of power Karen had ever again. There was a sense of accountability now, something that had been completely absent before. And it felt good. I had thought about moving, especially in those first few days of tension. But now I was glad I hadn't. This place, this community, was mine too. It was a place where the rules weren't made for a select few, but for everyone to live by. And if it had taken me standing up to Karen to get that, then so be it. I even found myself getting more involved. I volunteered to sit on the new HOA board, nothing too high profile, but enough to make sure the new rules were upheld. It felt right, being part of something that was about people, not power. I worked with neighbors to draft the new bylaws, making sure that no one would be able to pull what Karen had done again. There was a meeting not long ago, an open forum to discuss the future of the neighborhood. I remember sitting at the front of the room, listening to people speak with genuine interest, their voices filled with purpose and hope. They had all felt what it was like to live in fear, to feel silenced by a single individual's desires. But that was in the past now, and as I looked around the room, I realized something that I hadn't before. I wasn't just living in a neighborhood. I was part of a community, one that could fight back against injustice, one that could stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I truly belonged, and that, more than anything, was the most satisfying feeling of all. It's funny how quickly things can change. A few months ago, I was just another new guy with a flashy car, trying to fit in. Now, I wasn't just fitting in. I was shaping the community around me. There were times, during the worst moments of my conflict with Karen, when I thought about walking away. I considered packing up, leaving the neighborhood behind and finding somewhere else to live, somewhere easier. But if I had done that, I would have been running. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that running never gets you anywhere. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stand your ground, to face down the people who try to tear you down, and to keep fighting until you finally see the change you've been hoping for. It's not about the car or the house or the petty complaints. It's about the fight for what's right, the fight for fairness, and the fight to live on your own terms. Looking back now, I realize that I didn't just defeat Karen Whitley. I didn't just win the battle over a car or a tree. What I had done, what we had all done, was reclaim our power. We had taken back control of our neighborhood, of our community, and of our lives. And that was something Karen could never take away. In the end, I didn't need to park my helicopter in the backyard to prove my point. All I needed was the will to stand up and fight. And I'd won.